Okay, in week 5 attendance, a couple of you asked me to go over my code in more detail, and I'm totally open to doing that. I just want to say the following. A, my code represents my implementation concept, okay, and my ideas, as your code should be. And one of the hesitations sometimes I have about showing mine is that somebody will just take what I've done and make it work in their own environment. And that's not the idea. Okay. So this is an example. And the other thing is, I would say this is probably on the higher end of what I would expect to see, but I often like to challenge myself to push my skills because that's the way I enjoy teaching, is that I enjoy learning. Okay. So, um, I just want to say that, and again, this is just me going over it. So the thing I have, and the thing you will need to do for your dev is walk me through your code with DevTools. So I have my local server up and running. And by the way, I am going to post this code out in the public repo, but remember, your code goes in your private repo, not in the public. I'm posting this because somebody asked me to. Okay. And I'm doing this because somebody asked, and I definitely want to give you just a walkthrough of my code. So my code is based on charging my electric vehicle, and rather than just to run my functions with many different inputs, I decided it'd be kind of more fun to actually have it run for 25 times and create random data. So the first thing that where I set my breakpoint. Remember, here's how you set your breakpoint. I would set it here because if I refresh the page, this would be before anything outputs to the page. So when I refresh the page, right, that's where it's stopping and it's telling me that's my line of execution. So the first thing I do is run for random times. And actually, this is not the best name as I reflect on it, because it's actually run for 25 times, but the random times is actually related to the charging time and the charging data, or the battery status of the car. So if I step into this, right, so then I'm going to do a for loop. And inside this for loop, I'm going to use math.random to determine first and a second number. And what this is going to represent is this starting battery state and the ending battery state represented in percentages. And then I just make sure that, right, my starting would be greater than my would not be greater than my ending, so that the numbers would work out. So I do a little if logic here just to make sure. So then that determines, right, if they have to swap these numbers. And then I do, because I base it, to get cost, I would need how much is in the battery, how much do I want to charge to, and where am I charging? And this location is really that determination. And then I just randomly select. Now, this is not the date object in JavaScript. We'll learn about that later. So then I just determine if it's, I do a random for 0 or 1. So right now it'd be 0. And then if it's 0, it's home. And if it's 1, it's a supercharger. So it's cheaper for me to charge at home than at a supercharger. So that's part of course, the calculation. So then if it is 0, which in this case it is, then I'm going to run determine cost per session, and I pass it in these data parameters that I have determined, okay? And then that date. So then I call that, and that then is time to charge. It does a calculation to determine that. So it shows me how long it's going to take, right? And then I actually have to have a determine location variables. And what this is my cost per kilowatt, okay, is actually going to be different based on the different location. Now, in this case, I'm using something called a ternary operator. I barely mentioned that in my other video, but it's basically just a quicker way, one-line way of writing an if statement. So this basically says if location equal to home, right? then this is the kilowatt per hour, else it is the super kilowatt per hour. And then that gets stored in the charging rate so that I determine that based on my location, right? And then I return that charge rate and cost. And then and now that I have that, right? So now that I have that cost rate and I return it as an object here because it's just easier. As a matter of fact, you could have seen that down there. I should have talked about that. Guess it was above there somewhere. Okay, so then I do a minute and hour. I've flattened those so that it is a easier representation in my data. And then I set up an EV charging object. And what this is, because I have a global, my own, I actually have two globals. One is just for the car information, and the other one is for my charging. And so what I'm doing here is I'm storing that object or in this case, I'm creating it first and then I'm pushing it onto the array. So I have an array of objects and you can see all the data that I'm storing in here. Okay. So if I jump over that, we know what display on page does, so I'm not going to go over that. So then this gives me my first session output. Okay, my randomly battery was at 11%, charged to 20%, which is probably not realistic, but still, on this date, at home, cost 83 cents, took 0 hours, 51 minutes. So all that determination and flattening of those minute and hours has made that output a little better. And then I push that object into that array, so I have it. And then I come back here and I do it again and again and again. So I'm actually going to stop it here, just let it run. So at the very end, after that's all done, then I run random charging session data, where I calculate. You can see it at the very end. The last video I had a little problem. Let me just expand this out so you can see it a little better. Right here. So what I did is basically summed all of these costs together based on locations so far. I probably did it by home and super. No, I think I just did a global one. So that gives me my one piece of summary data that I needed to do to meet that. So what I used in this case is, again, something a little more advanced, but it totally is much easier to do. I basically did what's called a reduce, which is considered a higher order function, but it's basically like iterating over each one, grabbing the cost and just totaling it. And that gives me my sum, and then I just display it on page. So that's my code. This was a fun one for me, and I use this one as we continue on, especially as we get the user input, allow them to input the data is much more fun, but I at least did this in a way that made it interesting to me, just by randomly selecting it. The other benefit of doing it this way is it really tests all of my logic so that hopefully it's kind of a test. And if you've ever heard of test driven development, this is a way to kind of test without having a separate piece of software, which, by the way, is great. There's some great software out there for testing your code, but this was kind of a very simplified way of doing it. Now, you don't have to do this by any means, right? It's just a way I approach mine. And again, I want to reiterate, this was my approach. What I look for is your approach to coming up with your concept, writing code to that, and then coming in to talk to me about it. Okay, I look forward to meeting you all. I hope this helps. See you later.